arms and stronger hands. And going all the way back, many people said to me, you're a young rabbi, this goes back many years, why not begin a prayer service for young couples? And the young couples will come and there'll be a strong arm of the synagogue. And all the way back, even when I was in my 30s, 40s, I resisted that. I said, no, prayer as community must be intergenerational. It really has to be together, because I felt very, very strongly that different ages have much to learn from each other. And that seems to me what, Lance, I'd love you to read out that Psalm in 71:9, whatever the Psalm is. It sounds like it's if you have it there, Lance, please don't hesitate. Just have to unmute yourself.
Okay, here's probably not the best translation. Do not cast me away when I am old, not forsake me when my strength is gone.
Right. That, of course, is a sentence that we lift and we say in the Shema Kolenu, which is a special prayer that is said in the petitional tefillah and the slichot. Al tashlichenu le'et zikna, kichlot kochenu al tazvenu, and which means al tashlichenu, do not cast us off, le'et zikna, as we become older. It doesn't say, oh God, block me from becoming older. It says, don't cast me aside. And I think the prayer is not only to God, the prayer is that God's creations, human beings, won't cast the the elderly aside, which is often the case. So that was a kind of long reaction, Cindy. But so excuse me. So we have these rabbinical schools, and there's great sensitivity shown for people across the age spectrum. These are future rabbis. By this June, there will be 200 rabbis. There will be 200 rabbis who will have been ordained from the men's and the women's school. I hope one day, I wish they would merge, but the politics makes that difficult. But 200 rabbis, and many of them are dealing with populations, whatever the age, and this is an attempt to sensitize future rabbis on this issue.
You've done a great job, because I will say that I go on Monday evenings to the community Beit Midrash. And one of the things I enjoy about it is that I'm having an opportunity to learn with a group of young people. So I'm clearly the oldest person in the room, and I care not at all about that. Because going back to your initial question, I think one of the things that gerontologists are working towards is for older adults to embrace their authenticity. But I think that since we live in nuclear families in the West that are so separated, and that in terms of aging, we've embraced, unfortunately, the medical model versus other cultures where people are more likely to live in extended families throughout their lifetime. And I think there is ingrained in those countries more reverence for older adults and their position in the family, whereas in the West, when you give up your roles, i.e. when you give up working and your identification, in that world, people struggle to find new meaning in their lives, and people look at them differently because you're no longer the role that you played in your employment.
There was a word you used, and I forgot it already, showing my age, a very strong word that jumped out right in the beginning.
Authenticity.
Yeah, what that's exactly the word. What do you mean by that?
I think that as some of us age,
I'm looking down because I'm taking notes, so please.
That's fine. That's fine, Rabbi. very in our careers, we end up not so much really being ourselves and finding the truth within us as to who we are and what we want to do, but we spend an awful lot of our time meeting the expectations of others in order to succeed. Where when we give up those career roles and other community roles that we may pull back from as we age, we have an opportunity to embrace our authenticity, to be who we really are, to follow the things that are really meaningful to us, to express ourselves in a different way that we might have felt uncomfortable with when we had to meet the expectations of others.
I think that's beautiful. Cindy, do you mind if I mention your name to those who are pulling together this program?
Not at all.
So what did you do professionally, Cindy?
I was a social worker initially. Then I went back to school and got another degree. And then I taught part-time at Syracuse University in the Department of Child and Family Studies.
I did all the way back, the great Abraham Joshua Heschel spoke, I think it goes back to 1961. It was the Kennedy White House. And he spoke on aging, and I tried to get it up just now on my phone here, but I don't have that capacity. Shuli, if you're on, Shuli, are you on? I guess Shuli.
I am on. Here I am.
Shuli, do you know the Heschel quote that I always quote about?
Do you mean the one when I was young? Do you want me to look it up? Is that the one?
No, it's one, if you can, in Parshat Va'era, in the book Torat, Ahavah, there's a piece on this week's Parsha on aging. But actually the Heschel quote is, he writes that as we grow older, our older years can be the language he uses is our most formative years, which I find fascinating, because formative
I'm
years.
just going to look for it and I'll come right back to you.
If you can find it and then read it for us, because when one says formative years, we normatively associate that with the youngest years, that you have children who are toddlers who are growing up. That's whatever occurs to them shapes their personalities into the future. And he turned this idea on its head. And I think he touched on what, Cindy, you beautifully articulated, and that is what I heard you say, Cindy, is that when we're relieved of our outside burdens, then our true selves can come out. And that authenticity could just yield wonder, amazement that we have within ourselves, strengths, and we have within ourselves qualities that we never knew existed. I mean, I think it could work the other way too, couldn't it? And that is that when we no longer have as many external responsibilities, we may fear our inner authentic selves, and that may be part of it. That may be part of the quagmire, part of the struggle. I appreciate your bringing this up, Cindy.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure. I think you see that more in men than in women, where when roles are removed from them, they're not quite sure who they are. You'll see where, like, when a lot of women retire, they start exploring things that they never had time to explore before, whereas men struggle more with, okay, now what do I do? Who am I?
Yeah, I'm just opening up the portion of the week here.
I love the fact that Moses has a disability.
Yeah, but the power, I'm just commenting on this, and just for a moment, we've often raised the position of scholars that the Torah was written by different editors. And one of the proofs that are offered to support that position. I'm sure Murray would love to hear this, Sue, because Murray was really a student of scholarship. Every time Murray came to shul, I always wondered, Murray, what book do you have now? Let me take a look at it. And I was very actually pleased once he came with my son's book. So I liked that very much. And he actually came once to my son's lectures. Murray used to go to these scholarship conferences, and Murray loved that very, very much. And
I do have the quote, Rabbi, if you want me to read it.
okay, if you don't mind, go
It's
ahead.
we actually have it in Vayikra, in Sefer Vayikra. May I suggest that man's
Now
potential for change.
this is Abraham Heschel's words.
Yeah. May I suggest that man's potential for change and growth is much greater than we are willing to admit, and that old age be regarded not as the age of stagnation, but as the age of opportunities for inner growth. The years of old age may enable us to attain the high values we have failed to sense, the insights we have missed, the wisdom we have ignored. They are indeed formative years.
It's powerful. They're indeed formative years. It's quite something. Yeah. So Natalie, did you want to say something?
Yes, I did.
Natalie is the youngest of all of us.
I am as old as you get. So I can tell you that one of the things that I find about myself now is that I am gentler and softer in my responses to things than I was when I was younger. Age has gentled me.
Why is that? Do you have any feelings on that, Natalie?
Excuse me?
Do you have any feelings on why that happens? Why that has happened?
Experience has taught me that many of the things that we think are very important, as you get older, you realize you have a better sense of proportion, and you realize that it isn't worthwhile to fuss over something that's not going to be lasting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I want to throw out there, since we're talking about this, just a thought. I do see, Rita, you raised your hand if you want to say something. And this is on the portion of the week, because this is in the portion. It is fascinating, as Rav Ezra pointed out, that Moses was 80 years old. And, the big deal is, can Biden run again? He's going to be 80 or whatever. In the Torah, granted, Moses lived till 120 and Aaron lived till 123. Still, as my father would say, he was no chuchika. He was no youngster. It's fast. It's quite something. Quite something. Rita, did you want to say something? Rita? You're on mute, Rita, I think.
When I was young, I was very busy. I had a job, I had my children, my parents were 3 blocks away from me, and I did not have time for other interests. And now it surprises me, but like yesterday, we had somebody here, an expert on opera, and he put on the Fledermaus, and it's interesting and beautiful, and it was something that I thought to myself when I was young. I just did not participate in something like that. I had too many other things. Okay, friendships, I tried to keep up with friends, but I didn't really have time for intellectual studies. And it now is nice. So I think that's an important aspect people should realize about old age, that you have more time. you don't have so many responsibilities. So
Mhm.
you can fill it in with other enterprises.
Thank you. I want to read to you the most important sentence in the Torah that deals with aging. It's in chapter 19 of Leviticus, Vayikra Yotet, Lipnei Seva Takum, which is translated here, Lipnei Seva Takum, in the presence of an old person. I don't like that translation, but in the presence, before an older person, I think should be better, shall you rise. V'hadarta pnei zaken. I love that verb, v'hadarta. And you shall honor the presence of a sage. And then it says, v'yareta me'elokecha, and you shall revere the Lord, you shall revere God, Ani Adonai. Now, when you look at this, when you look at the sentence, you can imagine the commentaries really try to decipher it. If we can put everybody just on mute for a moment, Shul, I wanted to say a few things about this and then get everybody's, more important, your reaction. There are those who connect. First of all, there are three fragments in this sentence. Again, for those who wish to take a look at it, it's Leviticus 19:32. The three fragments of this sentence are, number one, mipnei seva takum, which means, again, you shall rise, you shall honor a sage. Seva is a sage. Then it says, v'hodarta pnei zoken, and you shall, v'hodarta, and you shall honor the, well, first it's mipnei seva takum, rise before the sage, v'hodarta, and you shall give honor pnei zaken, in the presence of an older person. And then it says, and fear the Lord. Now, if we look at the first two fragments, if we were studying this in a Bet Midrash, and the Talmud discusses this in Kiddushin, are these two fragments connected or are they independent? Let me explain to you what I mean. If we look at this sentence, one way to understand it is read that beginning in one flow, in one rhythm, and that is, Mipnei seva takum, before a sage you shall rise, and as v'hodarta pnei zoken, and honor the elderly, which seems to be limitative. That is, honor the elderly if the older person is a sage. In other words, there are boxes you have to check in this sentence. One box is the person is older, and a second box, which is also necessary, is that this older person be a scholar. So I'm just reading now from Rashi, and this is based on Kiddushin 32. The two halves of the verse explain one another, meaning that the commandment is to rise and honor a sage who is both elderly and whatever seva means. Elderly, Zaken is elderly. Seva means one who is learned, one who is a sage, one who is righteous. That's one way of understanding it, and the Talmud presents it. But then the Talmud says, and this is the view, that these two fragments should be understood independently. That is, the text first says, before a sage you shall rise. Now, even though when one says sage, one does think of older years, one could be a sage and be younger. I think a very good example of this is, again, I've not looked up the exact translation of sage. I wonder whether technically is it always associated with age. But when I think of Rabbi Stephen, for example, this is a young man who's a sage. I mean, I think he's 40. I think he just passed 40 years old. He has the sensitivities, he has the wisdom of somebody who is more than twice his age. Every time I talk to Rev Stephen, his capacity to listen, his capacity to allow for another view, and I think he's a genius just in his, one could hear it in his elocution, in his language, and his understanding of all kinds of text, from Talmudic text to halachic text to all kinds of texts. So one could understand if Bnei Seva Takum is an independent statement. If somebody is a sage, rise. And then the separate statement is, V'adarta Pnei Zokain, and honor the elderly. Why? Give honor, the Gemara says, to someone who is older, even if they're not that learned. But even if, their life is a life like all of us, where there's some good checks we have, there are not so good checks that we have. But by virtue of being older, a person has life experience, and life experience is enough to honor. So I'm reading the second interpretation. Others hold that these are two separate commandments: to rise for and honor anyone, rise and honor anyone who is older, even if this person is not learned. In other words, rise for a sage, that's one fragment. And the second, Mipnei Seva Takum, and then as a separate fragment, it's V'hadarta Pnei Zaken. And that is the salient view. That is the view that really, really counts. And I am, if I may, I don't say this to impress, but to make a point, that has always been a centerpiece of the Bayit, that to revere, not just to honor, to revere those who are older. And I just want to say one more thing, cutting it in two directions, and then get your feelings on it. My sense is that in society itself, certainly the Western culture, as we said before, segregates the elderly, pushes the elderly aside. And you've heard me say this, a lot of Western, not just Western thought, a lot of Western policy has something to do with commercialization. If you are a person who can contribute to the commercial enterprise, either you're in the workforce or you are a person who is a good candidate to acquire and to purchase all kinds of merchandise, then you're lifted to a very, very high level. But if you're not in that world, that is to say that there's less that one can contribute to the commerce, then you're pushed aside. All one has to do is look at, and this we've discussed as well, as at the advertisements on TV, outside of some assisted living, it's mostly young people whom you see. You see their pictures, you see their photographs. They're the ones who sell products. They're the ones who buy products. As we get older, we probably spend less. Again, there are exceptions to it, but by and large, I think statistics will bear that out. And because of that and other reasons, we're not in the workforce, it's quite possible that society looks down on people as they get older, pay less attention to people as they get older. People who have been involved in all kinds of enterprises, to whom people turn and want their opinions as we grow older. Often it occurs in Western culture that people are not as interested in that individual. And it's precisely because that could be an age of vulnerability that I think the Torah goes out of its way. And the Torah says, wait a minute, V'hadarta Pnei Zaken. A person who is older, that person the Hadarta must be honored. But I want to say it in a flip way. I'd like to argue, and here I really would like to get your reaction, that it's not only society that could look down or think that as one is older, there is less that this person has to contribute. I think we're living in a world where older people begin to feel that they can only contribute minimally to society. And it becomes what some call a self-fulfilling prophecy. If older people think that we are contributing less, then in the end, we are going to contribute less. We are going to do less. I remember sitting in Washington, D.C. I was coming back by the Amtrak from Washington, New York. And this is the first time I recognized I was getting older. And I hear an announcement, if you're 62, you can get half fare. And I said, wait a minute, I just turned 62. I could get half fare. And I remember going up and buying my ticket, and the person said, I said to the person, I heard the announcement, and I want you to know I am 62, but on principle, I'm not going to pay half fare. I'm not going to pay half fare. Well, that didn't last that long, because maybe that time I didn't pay half fare. I don't remember it, but as we went along, I was paying half fare. And the truth of the matter is, I think the whole idea that you pay half fare, it's a nice gesture of society. Maybe it shows honor to people as they grow older for all that they have contributed in the past. Maybe it means that it's a recognition that as we get older, we may not have as much money available, so pay half fare. But like all positives, it has a negative. And the negative is, if you pay half fare, you begin to think that I am half. I'm not worth the whole. And that could become, I think, very, very problematic. So it's not only that I think society looks at older people as less capable of contributing. Often society looks at the elderly in that way, but it's those who are older who begin to think of themselves as only being able to contribute partially. And that's the sentence, Mipnei seva takum, rise before the learned person, whatever the age. And as a separate fragment, it says, the hodarta pnei zaken. Understand, as many were saying before, that as we grow older, I love, Cindy, the word authenticity. Maybe that's the challenge, to find out who we really are, that these can be our most formative years. And then the text continues, and V'yaretam Elohecha ani Adonai, fear the Lord, fear God, I am the Lord. I remember when my father, we always joke about my father, we say, Abba did his 90s great. Before my father reached 90, having been raised in Poland, he loved us very much, but he could never say, I love you. That was not his thing. He just, in his 90s, he started saying, I love you. We say Abba did his 90s great, did his 90s great. So I was once discussing, I had the great honor to study with my father, and my father pointed out this sentence, and he said, well, after it says, honor the sage, honor the elderly, why does the sentence end with, I am the Lord? Why? So I responded with a traditional response. Rashi in the Medrash says that, you could be in the presence of an older person. You're on a bus, an older person gets on the bus, and if you're seated, what you should do is get up. And when we were kids, that's what we used to do. But when we were very tired, you know what we did? We closed our eyes. We made believe we didn't see the older person on the bus, and we didn't get up. So Rashi actually says here, I am the Lord. I know if you see or if you don't see. You can't fool me, God says. I know if you're just closing your eyes and making believe you don't see the needs of an older person. So I gave that answer to my father, and then my father turned to me and he beautifully said, let me offer just a different interpretation. He said, who is the oldest entity in the world? I said, Abba, what are you talking about? He said, I didn't ask you who's the oldest person. I didn't ask you, show me the oldest tree. I want you to show me who is the oldest entity. And then he said, of course, God is the oldest entity. He's the chairperson of the senior club at the Century. He's a chairwoman or chairman or chair it or chair they. He's the top. So the sentence ends with, I am the Lord. I take it very, as the older person, quote unquote, God says, I take very personally if you don't respect the elderly, very personally, because if you don't respect the elderly, you're showing disrespect to God. It's a comment I never, ever, ever forgot. Let me stop there and get your reaction to it. We're just warming up. So Cindy, this is all in your honor, I guess. You got us, but it's the portion of the week. We're not off topic.
Nope. I want to reimagine part of this, I guess. When it says to rise, and I haven't got this completely thought through, so I'll have to ponder it post class a little bit more. But I don't see that as a physical rise as much as I see that rising through the Tensafirot, and that in the presence of not only the older person, the sage, but in presence of Hashem, our commandment to rise through the Sefirot and hopefully to rise to our own status of wisdom. And you talked about the first two clauses, or however the grammar is in Hebrew, which I've woefully forgotten, but that I look at that last section and I'm always hesitant to translate Yirah as fear of Hashem, because I don't think I want to live in fear. I think I want to live in awe of Hashem, and that I think that fits more with understanding the rise as transitioning through the Sefirot.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a couple of things about etymology. First, the comment that you just made about fear. The Art Scroll does translate, they use the word revere your God. You use the word being in awe of God. The word yoreh, Yud Resh Aleph, could also be a play on the word of Ra'ah, which means to feel the presence of, V'yareta melokecha,
Right.
fear the presence of God. So in one breath, if one feels the presence, if one has that belief, one is in awe of God, but at the same time, hopefully I can feel presence and feel the love of God, the embrace of God. So it meshes into Ahavah. And as you were speaking, I'm looking at that word seva, and even though seva could be translated that one should rise, as you said, not only physically, but metaphysically in every which way before sage. And the sage could be younger, but seva is normatively associated with an older person. And as a student of words, if we look at the word seva, sin, yud, bet, hey, I do not think it's a coincidence that that word is a composite of two words. The first word is sin or shin yud, shai, and shai means gift. Shai means beauty, and ba means in her, in him, in it. And it actually, this is the first time I've seen it, but I just, my instincts saw there's some truth to this. Seva means that when, as a person grows older, you think that person has no beauty. Shai ba, in that person, there is great beauty. I know that in the world today, often when we get older, our quest is to look younger. We don't like our wrinkles, even though as Daniela Grunfeld once said to me, you know, as we get older, we've earned our lines. Lines could be beautiful too. What's wrong with lines? What's wrong with a wrinkle? For me, there's something wrong if I hit 70 and 90 and 100 and I'm trying to dress like I'm 20 and 30. There's beauty. I once saw a person, I was down in Arizona, and I was introduced by Adam Steinberg, a young man. He took me to the Hopi reservation because there were many Jews on that reservation. It was fascinating to see. And I also met a great psychiatrist. His name was Hammerschlag. He was raised in Washington Heights in a very Orthodox area, but he was the top psychiatrist there, and he had a little Jewishness, beautiful man. And it's fascinating how on that reservation they venerated older people. And I was introduced to a woman who was 119 years old. And when you looked at her face, she had wrinkles everywhere. And I still can remember her face. She had great beauty. She was a beautiful, beautiful person. So just thank you for that comment on the Areta and more. And Shuli, can you help me out? Who wanted the floor?
Linda and then Arnie.
Linda, please.
I have a few things to say. First of
I'm
all,
taking notes, so please excuse me.
I'm finding as I get older that sometimes when you're in a store or somewhere, people seem to doubt your intelligence. They sort of treat you like a child. It's hard to say infantile. So they treat you like a child. And I find that wisdom not necessarily equates with education. I've known a lot of people who weren't able to have a good education from my family, people who, because of the Depression, because of the Holocaust. My own grandmother, who grew up in Europe, she was one of 10, and the boys got the education. After 8th grade, the girls had to leave school, and there was only money to send the boys further on to school. But she was one of the wisest people that I know and the most intelligent. And even into her 90s, she lived over 100. She would read the paper. She would go to discussion groups on politics and everything. She was one of the smartest people I knew. So it's not necessarily how educated you are, but how you react to the world and the thinking that you do on your own and the learning that you do on your own. My father-in-law had to drop out of school. He used to read the encyclopedia. He'd read the newspaper from cover to cover. And my mother, because of the Holocaust, she had a really interrupted education. And yet, if you had a problem, she was the one everybody came to, and she'd come up with the solution. So there is wisdom acquired, but not necessarily through education. So it's not necessarily the most learned. People acquire different skills throughout their lives from other ways as well.
I love that term. What I'm hearing, Linda, you're distinguishing, let's say, between a scholar of a book, let's say, whatever the gender, and wisdom. And right. I think there's a lot of truth to that. You could be a scholar of a book and have little wisdom of life, and it works in both ways. So, and I appreciate that so much.
It's very funny. When my mother passed away, my son did a eulogy, and he said that she would listen quietly. You tell her, she was a hairdresser, so she used to kind of barber. So she'd cut his hair, and he'd tell her all his problems. And she listened very quietly. And he said, you'd think she wasn't listening at all. She was just uh-huh. And then he said she would come out with the perfect solution to whatever the issue was that was bothering him. And that's what he remembers his grandmother for. And because of the Holocaust, she had a very interrupted education. But the common sense and the wisdom that came out of her was amazing. So
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. You know, I take the idea of intergenerationality very far. I mentioned to you that I fundamentally believe that prayer services should never be organized by age. It's not that I couldn't offer arguments that I think that there could be some positive in having young couples together. Yes, young couples, they would say, were able to meet other young couples, but in life, there's very few absolute. And when I think about the downside of separating young from old, that's very disturbing to me, because young people, they could have little children who are only in synagogue on Shabbat, and in, if I may, in their formative years between 0 and 3 and 4, they never see the tears of an older person in synagogue. And young people not sitting near older people can't be gaining from the wisdom of older people. I think younger people very much lose out. And in the same breath, I believe that older people lose out. I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who said, you stay young when you're around young people. I mean, I feel I'm staying young because, first of all, I think many of your ideas are young ideas. They're refreshing ideas, but when I'm interacting with students from Marat and Chovevei, they've taught me a great deal. Wherever I've come, for example, on all kinds of radical issues, some of which you may agree with, not agree with, but I have a different understanding now because I'm around young people on LGBT issues, on trans issues. What did I know about trans? I didn't even know how to understand what it is. And I'm not quite there at all. But when one is around young people, one stays young. And there's nothing, they say, the Talmud says that Abraham, our patriarch, used to walk around with a little pendant around his neck. And on one side, there was a picture of an older person. And on the other side, there was a picture of a younger person. So it just seems to me, and this is a radical idea, when presenting this, there's often been pushback. I felt that at schools like SAR and Frisch and Ramaz and all these schools, as well as in public schools, I think there should be a far greater integration of ages. That is to say, yeah, there are times when the younger folks at a school will visit an assisted living or a nursing home, quote unquote. There are times when older people are brought into the school. I think it should be a tapestry that is intrinsic to the learning. Take Hillel's on campus. These are very important years for young men and women. They're between the ages of 18, 19, 20, and 23, 24. And it becomes an experience where they're with people their age. And I'm wondering, what would be if there would be much more of a push to have a full integration? Again, I'm saying now for the third time that is a push, and there would be a lot of resistance. But I think that society could gain a tremendous amount on every level if there was a much fuller integration of ages. I think it was Arnie wanted to say something. Did you, Arnie?
Yes, I have two quick things I wanted to mention. One, just as kind of a sidelight, in baseball, the trend is to hire younger managers who can relate better to the players. But the World Series this year was played between two teams led by among the oldest managers ever, and their players loved them. So for what it's worth.
Dusty Baker, and who is the other?
Dusty Baker, and I forget the name, the Atlanta manager was,
Yes.
I think, Joseph, I forget his first name.
Yosef Ben Moshe, Arnie. The Rivka.
He would have been a better manager yet.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to say regarding fear of the Lord and awe of the Lord, reading last week's Parsha this year, I was struck, I guess, by, how God appears in a fire And he warns Moshe, don't come close. Don't come close to me or you'll be destroyed. And then it occurred to me for the first time that, I don't know if this is true or I'm just imagining this, but Horeb is related to the term korban, which was the term that long before Holocaust came into use, that was the term for the destruction of European Jewry, the korban. So it's in obliterating destruction. And this year, it bothered me thinking of God as this potentially destructive force. Now, I know if you misinterpret God, let's say you've always pointed out the people who bombed the World Trade Center were doing it in God's name, but that was a blasphemy. But God is not saying that. God is not saying if you worship me wrongly, you'll be destroyed. God is saying if you come too close to me, you'll be destroyed. If you come to my mountain, what does that mean? That my mountain is named destruction. So I'm really perplexed by this. If you have anything to say about it, I would appreciate it.
No, I that's a good point. And actually, looking at this, I want to think about it. I was wondering whether I could look at the word chorev, which also comes from the word cherev, which means sword. And I have to think about that, what I could do with that word. And I think your question is, it's a deep question. The best I could do with it now, Arnie, and I think it needs much more thinking, is at where the burning bush was, that was Mount Chorev. It was also the place where the Torah was given. The Torah is given on Mount Chorev. And on the one end, in the one breath, one would think this was the highest level of experiencing God. So by dint of the experience, it could lift you to exalted places. But what could be said is that it's precisely in moments that one can reach and achieve exaltation that could be the most dangerous moments. And it's almost like a warning that as you're reaching the highest levels of communicating with God, of experiencing God, beware. That could be dangerous. That could be very dangerous. And we've seen that. We've seen that, as I've mentioned many times, there is nothing as wonderful as, I believe, if one believes in God, but there's nothing more dangerous if one distorts what God is all about. And it's precisely when one reaches the highest levels that one could be most vulnerable. So I guess what I'm arguing is that the experience itself was, they're experiencing revelation. And what's being said is that even when you're experiencing, or you think you're experiencing revelation, even when you're dancing with God, be careful. Be very, very, very careful. Because if you misunderstand this moment and you're so close to God and you begin to think that, you are God's spokesperson or you're a godly person and that power could go to your head and you could abuse that power. That's the horror of what we read about when clergy persons or anyone in authority who abuses their power by taking advantage of others. That is to say, you could reach a certain point where you're in a trusted position. You're speaking the Torah, you're in a very trusted position. Beware of that. Beware of that, because when you're in that trusted position and your people are leaning on you, that's the potential of it becoming a churban, Arnie. So,
Springing off what you're saying, it's also like when you get close with people, the more you get close with them, the more you feel like you know them. And God is ultimately unknowable. So maybe it's when, if you get too close to God and you think you know God, watch out, because you don't know really God in God's unknowable capacity.
I appreciate that. Just something I want to share with you, but this is a nuanced kind of idea that, the word for God that we use in rabbinic literature is, and then I'm going to stop because I want to hear from Tova, Ellen, and Cindy, is Shekhinah. So if you can all say that to yourself, Shekhinah. It's a word that's constantly used. Shekhinah comes from the word shochen, which means neighbor. Shochen, Shekhinah is like the omnipresence. It's a term for God. Some people use the English term of indwelling. God is the indwelling. But what's fascinating, Arnie, is that word Shekhinah. The word Shekhinah is found nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in the prophets, nowhere in the writings, sometimes called the hagiograph. It's not found anywhere. Shekhinah is a term which was introduced. It is introduced post the destruction of the temple. Until the destruction of the temple, we don't find the word Shekhinah at all. We find other words, like, for example, the tabernacle is called Mishkan. Yes, it sounds like Shekhinah, the noun Mishkan. You find a verb where God says, Vishochanti, and I will dwell in the tabernacle. And I think one can argue, and Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, God bless him, he should be well, often speaks about this, that when we were in the temple, Judaism was very temple-centered. And it's almost like all of God was in one place. It was in the Holy of Holies. And the voltage was very, very high. And with the voltage being so high, if you touch that voltage right away, it could bring about the end. It could bring about death. That's why in the Bible, there's so much discussion of don't come into the Holy of Holies. Don't touch that centerpiece, the Kruvim of God. That could cause literally death. But after the temple was destroyed, what happened is, now that was a terrible thing, but there was a positive. Like all terrible things has a positive. The positive was that which the God, which was concentrated in one place, the voltage, if you will, was diffused all over the world. That the center piece was no longer the temple, but it was the synagogues and it was the yeshivot all over the world. And it's not that there was less God, but in each place, God was more accessible. The voltage wasn't as high. And as a consequence, one could have more of a it's counterintuitive, but post the destruction of the temple, that's the time when God could be called Shekhinah. It's then that God could become my neighbor. During the time of the temple, it was too intense. Post-temple, it was less intense. So, Arnie, you're in your home. Homes could be holy places. Your home is a holy place with books you love to learn and everything about you and Debbie. There's a holiness. There's a presence of God. God is more, I would say that God may be, precisely because God is more diffuse, D-I-F-F-U-S-E, after the destruction of the temple, God may be less visible, but he's more present. It's counterintuitive. In the temple time, God was more present, but you have to stay away. Post-temple, God is is less visible. We don't have the visibility of God that we had during the time of the prophets, where God appears so clearly. Yeah, God may be less visible, but he's more present. It's almost like when we think about our loved ones who have passed on. Our loved ones who have passed on, they may be less visible. They are less visible, I guess, but they could be more present. They could be more present. That analogy is not perfect because I don't believe God is dead. It's not like God has passed on, but God, the God in the temple, it's the God that we're worshiping is appearing through a different prism. So let's get everyone's comment here. Anyone, Tova, please? If I'm looking down, I'm taking notes. You're on mute, Tova.
Like Arnie, after last week's session, I was thinking of fire and thinking about the burning bush and the fire that didn't consume. And I think that one of the things that was there to teach us is that about God, I related to a fire that doesn't consume, so that we can't live without fire. And yet it has to emanate. We can't get too close to it, but it always emanates to us the good. Something that is dangerous, and yet we can't come too close, but we must have it. This is where the godliness, this is where the truth comes. I don't know. And then when you were just talking about the Kodesh, Kodeshim, and well, the Christians call that the Holy Ghost, the what godliness that emanates over us all, and we call it the Shekhinah, that the Shekhinah is always with us. And at the beginning, when you spoke about the elderly, were included, Moshe included them when he came to Paro. That means that the elderly also came out. And then we had the attack by Amalek. And we were told that Amalek attacked the vulnerable among us. Who were the vulnerable? They were the elderly. They were in back. And I think that was to teach us, Zechoret Amalek, remember that the elderly must be in the center of us, protected, and not left to be attacked by Amalek. So I think Zechoret Amalek is not just to Zechor the villainous of Amalek, but our own mistake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. And Tova, and I think the measure of society is how society reaches out to those who are more vulnerable. That's the test. And that's the test. I think that's the test of community. That's the test of. So if there are others, Shuli, if you can call on everyone. This is
we have
session.
Ellen, and then Cindy and Vivian. Did I miss anyone? And anyone else, put up your hand if you're waiting. And Graham. So
Okay.
Ellen, Cindy, Vivian, Graham.
All right, I wanted to go back to the phrase "all rise" because I recently went to the Broadway production of To Kill a Mockingbird. And whatever else I felt about it, and it was Aaron Sorkin's interpretation, and it certainly didn't always stick to the text. But the very first words spoken on stage by Scout were "all rise." And the very last words from at the end of the play was "all rise." And it was really extremely moving. In the beginning, it was just the judge is supposed to be coming in and that's the phrase, "all rise," and the judge walks in. But at the end, after all the horror of To Kill a Mockingbird, there's that aspiration
of all, and the plea to the audience of all rise. And I think that that's what, in many ways, that phrase, all rise before a page you shall rise, before a sage you shall rise. It's like the aspiration that we have to rise up to the best of our selves.
I love that.
And that was the very first and last phrase. And it I mean, I didn't like a lot of the play, but that moved me tremendously, that after it all, it was all rise, and please all rise to it. So it's the aspirational approach, I think.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And now Cindy. Thank you, Ellen.
Am I unmuted? Okay, I wasn't sure if I was unmuted. So going back to the discussion of the burning bush, or lack thereof, the bush wasn't really burning, but the fire. So Hashem created us as physical entities with a spiritual component. That is our soul or our nefesh, or however we want to understand that. And I think that the challenge is for humans is how to be both physical and live in the physical world and do our tasks in the physical world, and yet to be in touch with our spirituality and to have a spiritual life and to have a connection to Hashem. And that we can't go out of our physical being. We always have to be physically present, even as we try to be spiritually present. And I think that's where we have to stay away from trying to live only in the spiritual world. And that's what's dangerous. And as somebody who tries at least to have a meditative practice, a Jewish meditative practice, you do have to be careful, because you can get into a state of being in which you almost don't want to come back to the physical world because you're so happy being in that spiritual space. And we also see the consequences of that with Nadav and Abihu, where they decided that they were going to try to transcend the boundaries that Hashem created, and they wanted to be something else, and they didn't want to accept the fact that Hashem gives us all gifts, but the gifts that are given to some are different than the gifts that are given to others. And they wanted to transcend that. They wanted somebody else's gift, and they wanted to be spiritual, and they played with that, as it was described, alien fire. And again, my biblical Hebrew is terrible. And they literally got burned. And
Yes.
I think
I
that's,
think you're touching, Cindy, on one of the major contributions, the major differences between what Yahadut, what Judaism has to offer, and many other faith communities. In many faiths, the dogma is that you find spirituality by separating yourself from earthiness, from physicality. Judaism very, very much believes that spirituality must be found in earthiness, not separate and apart. Rabbi Kook was known to say that the first chief rabbi of, when he died in 1935, Ashkenazic rabbi of what would become Israel, he would say there's no such thing as the unholy. There is only the holy and the not yet holy. And what he was saying is that for Rav Kook, holiness is not only the way I pray, not only the way I meditate, not only the way I fast, but holiness is the way I eat, the way I conduct myself in business, the way one makes love, all of that has the potential of holiness. It's not holiness apart from physicality, but
because so
it's
many,
finding,
so many of our commandments are
yes,
physical commandments. They're things that we're doing in the physical world, but I always like to refer to them as our 613 opportunities rather than
that's
commitments.
great. That's
Because
great.
That's
probably the reason why that the spiritual leaders in Judaism are not to be celibate. They're not to separate from physicality, but physicality is to be celebrated by being sanctified. So thank you, Cindy. Vivian, did you want to say something? And then we're going to stop pretty soon. Then I saw Graham, and then I saw Arnie says it can't go to our heads. So I want to see what Arnie has in mind. But Vivian?
Just briefly, going back to the situation when the temple was destroyed and all the Jews were out in diaspora. So by then, Judaism had to be changed because all of the Jews were vulnerable, not just the elderly, and everyone had to be treated like the elderly. They were in different communities and they were at the mercy of the people around them, the non-Jews, and they had to find a way. And that's why the Shekhinah became so important, that everyone was vulnerable. And they found that prayer and the Beit Knesset, the place of assembly for Jews. Beit Knesset is not just a shul, a place to pray, but it's also a place where Jews would assemble. And when Jews traveled from place to place, they would come to the Beit Knesset, and there they would find food, and they would find a place to sleep and other Jews to relate to, and protection, which was the most important. So I just wanted to bring that up, that in the diaspora, we are all vulnerable, not just the elderly.
I love that you put in there, Vivian, as usual, a sentence that after the destruction of the temple, everyone, I just quoted what you said, jotted down, everyone had to be treated as the elderly. Maybe that's why change occurred. Were it only the elderly, maybe it would not have happened, but precisely because everyone was vulnerable, there was a recognition, we better do something. This is the big battle between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Akiva said, let's fight for Jerusalem, let's fight for the temple. And Yochanan ben Zakkai said, no, let's open it up in Yavne, all over the place. So
may I say something? I haven't said anything, Avi.
Yes, of course, Estelle.
I've been listening to all of these communications and all of these ideas, and what seems to hit me all the time is we're referring to outside influences on the old, on the aged, or on the people themselves. But what about inward self-fulfillment, inward getting yourself doing something without relying on anything spiritual or above you? What about just the inner part of you that wants to get ahead or wants to do things regardless of your age, even if you're 94 or whatever, but just to do it because inside you want to do it.
And I that's wonderful, Estelle. And I would push a little bit and say, and what is it inside? It's sort of what Ellen beautifully said. That's a beautiful contribution, all rise. So Ellen said at the end of Kill a Mockingbird, it was, can everyone rise? And it's an inner voice. And
well, I don't know if all rise refers to spiritual. It was just all rise before the law. That's basically what it was. But this, I mean, to be inside doesn't have to be a spiritual idea. It could be just an inner drive.
Right. Right. And what is that, Estelle? It's an inner drive to do what? To study, to read, to do good.
Yes, yes, but
Right.
it doesn't have to come from outside. It has to come from inside.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
everything you're referring to is that God is doing this, and outside influence is forcing you to do something. Well, forcing you nicely, but something within you doesn't have to come from an outside source. That's all
Right.
I'm saying.
Right. No, I hear that. And I would agree with that. I would argue that, and who knows, I don't know, that's for sure, but I would argue that what's inside of us is a godliness.
I mean,
that
that's
I would argue, and you would disagree with me, that there's a Godhead above, and that's why we respect and love each other. So we agree to disagree on that, and that's a leap of faith. Either one has it. But I think separate from that, God works through people. God works through people. The ability of people to do that which we never ever thought we could do. We see it constantly. When faced with challenges, ordinary people do extraordinary things. That's a cliche.
and you're attributing this to an outside force to do it for the inside person.
Even if let me see if this makes any sense to you. Putting aside the outside source of God above me, I'm attributing it to that part of God within me. It's a godliness within me. Look, there have been those, these are my friends, Rabbi Schulweis, conservative rabbi. He always spoke about the predicate God. He had problems with God, but he spoke about, we can learn from the kindness of God. And so I'm trying to appeal to you, Estelle, and say, looking at it from your perspective, where does that come from on the inside, the yearning of a human being to make a difference, to do good, to be there for others? I'm arguing that that's the way God works through people. Who writes a lot about this and writes beautifully about it? It's Harold Kushner in When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He spends a lot of time on that. Even he, who struggles with the God above, and he says that events could be random. And I remember once I was giving a seminar to colleagues in Boston, and before Rosh Hashanah, and it was a wonderful setting. And you talk there for an hour or two to colleagues. It's not easy talking to colleagues because they know much more than I know. And I came up to a point where I was quoting Harold Kushner. And I said, I've never met Harold Kushner. His book had a big impact on me, but I disagree with half of his book because I don't think things happen at random. But there's another piece of God working through people I really identify with. One of the great moments for me was, Estelle, that when I was through, someone walked up to me and said, "I'm Harold Kushner." So that was a great. I'm glad. Yeah. Anyway, so. Arnie, you wanted to say something, and then Robert or Graham, I think, wanted to say something too.
Yeah, I just was pointing out in, I hope, a humorous way that, it's one thing to honor the elderly, but it shouldn't go to the elderly's head, because Moses also said to take the flocks and the herds with him, as well as the old and the young.
Right.
So I think
got it.
I think the Torah's point is basically honor everybody for where they're at. We shouldn't necessarily think of children as lesser because they're young and little. We shouldn't think of elderly because the natural process of aging carries with it certain deterioration of the body. For whatever reason, every person has validity that needs to be respected.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Everyone has validity. Graham, did you want to say something? Thank you, Arnie.
Yeah, it's a great discussion. Thank you. But this discussion reminds me of a story I heard a long time ago, and I forget where, but it was about trying to toast marshmallows around a campfire. And so our relationship to God is like our relationship to this campfire. You get too close, you get burned. You stand too far away, you don't get warmed.
Mm.
But if you get it right, you can toast your marshmallows, no problem. So maybe the burning bush is an illustration of this campfire principle.
I
But
like that, Graham.
as the Zen Buddhists say, your whatever, yours is to find the middle way, quote unquote. So find your balance point.
Mhm.
Every person has a different balance point, and authenticity is respecting the process ongoing of finding the balance point. So, and finding authenticity is classic hero's journey, looking for authenticity.
Mm.
Finding like what Stella was saying, finding a dynamic balance between outer and inner responses to all the situations that come up every day.
Beautiful, Graham. I just want, just as a comment, Maimonides writes in his code, in his Yad HaChazakah, he famously talks about the Shvil HaZahav, we should look for the golden mean. He does say, though, that there are two characteristics where we should go to the extreme, because if we go for the middle, we're just not going to even attain the middle. He says that when it comes to humility, try to go to the extreme to be humble. And the other is anger. He said, go to the extreme trying to avoid anger, even though I think at times anger could have its positives, although you know what they say about anger. If you remain angry, I first heard this from Rabbi Twersky, but I was told that others have said it. If I'm angry at someone and I hold on to that anger weeks later, years later, then I'm allowing that person to live in my head without paying rent. I think that's the line, something like that.
All right.
And, that's why if you can remove that, it can be very helpful. Robert, my Robert.
Hi.
I'm How are you feeling, Robert? Robert,
Actually,
how are you feeling?
Thank God, really well. Really
good.
I work at feeling better, and I think I'm like 95% of where I was.
Good, Robert.
Which is good. And other people have commented, getting older, aging has knocked off some of my rougher edges.
Right.
A brief comment I'll come in between what Graham said, which was wonderful, and what Arnie said. See, there's the memory thing. I have to remember what I was saying. Thinking of the burning bush, not as necessarily fire. It doesn't have to burn. It could be just illumination. Moshe coming across, he was attracted to the light. He didn't necessarily feel the heat, but he was attracted by the illumination of it. And if we see fire as illumination, it's a good way of helping find our path, or there's other parables about that.
And of course, you're a great, Robert's.
Don't forget, it's also dangerous.
Not only honoring, but respect.
Robert's a great photographer, and has taken very well-known photos around the world and for newspapers and more. And I guess when you look at a photo, as you were speaking, I was thinking that photo was supposed to take the viewer somewhere else. You see the photo, but in your own way, Robert, it's an illumination, isn't it? I think a great photo, do your eyes remain just on that one dimension of the photo? The photo is much more than that, I would think.
I'm thinking about what you said. I've always thought it as it captures a moment in time and the relationship of the objects, the people, the space in that picture. And it, in freezing it, it reveals things about who, what, when, where, and what they were doing.
And it's in a certain sense, it's the bush, and it's never consumed. It's there. It brings together all kinds of stuff. This has been wonderful. So Cindy, we all have, I have taken voracious notes, and this will go into my files because I've learned so much from all of you today, and I so appreciate it. And we're on for next week, and that's the, Lance, did you want to say something? By all means. Lance, where are you talking from? You're in?
I'm in Hewlett, New York, on Long Island.
Well,
I shared some thoughts, and I got some very positive results, and I appreciate that from Graham and Arnie, for example. And I think that, Rav Avi, your passion and compassion are what make you a great rabbi. And I think the Bayit is probably the finest religious locality in the world.
No, I do appreciate that. And as I always say, I'm living a dream, because I always wondered what would be, and just to see where the Bayit is now. And I'm very proud of, I don't mean this in a paternalistic way, because Rav Stephen and Rav Ezra and Bracha and Sarah and Dov, they don't need my assent, but I think they've taken it, I appreciate it, Lance, to a new level. And it's the contribution of all of you and so many people. It's a special place. There's no doubt about it. I was thinking when Rav Ezra spoke so beautifully, I don't know how many of you were there, he spoke about Mayan openly. Very, very few Orthodox synagogues. I don't think you can count on one hand that could tolerate that. And yet it was so thoughtful, and gave us something to think about, whether one agrees or disagrees. And they should just continue doing great things. And these past 2 years have not been easy. Been very, very tough years. And I think the Bayit has written the template, just trying to stay in touch with people. God bless them all. Hi, Minda, I see you over there. Are you up in New England somewhere?
Yes, I'm in Vermont. I'm off this week from school, so I thought I'd say hi.
It's great to see you, Minda. How's your daughter?
Terrific. She's in New York.
Oh, good. I
Thank
remember
you.
years ago, did I see her at Brandeis once?
Yes.
She went to Brandeis.
Many
Joyce,
years ago.
how are you doing, Joyce? Good. You're on mute, but good. And Judy, I see Judy Frank is on. Judy Stieglitz. Just to all of you, hard to say goodbye, but I do see Shana Leah is on, of course.
May I ask 2 questions, Bobby?
Yeah. I see Sai is on, Carol's on. Yes, please.
The first question is, the wording of Lifnei Seva Takum. Does that mean Seva, like in V'achalta V'savata, in fullness? So when a person has reached his age, then he's reached, all of his fullness of his life.
I love that. I had not thought of that, and I'm jotting that down too. It's the same letters, and it's the letters of Shabbat too, Savata.
Right.
And that, the Hebrew language is, there are less words in Hebrew than English, but the unity of the verbiage it's right there. And I think what you said now is, I just feel instinctively it's absolutely correct. It's a great insight, Judy.
Okay, another question. Is there any mention of the grandchildren of Aharon and Moshe in the Torah?
There is mention. I can't put my fingers on it now, but the Talmud talks about it. I'll try to get that for next week, but yes.
And how the grandchildren, did they revere their grandparents?
Mhm. Yeah, look, these are great questions. I'll have to, I'm jotting this down too, Judy. So, but I do recall that their grandchildren are mentioned. Yeah, grandchildren of Moshe. Okay. I'll put that on my list of hundreds of things I have to look up. On that note, everyone, just have a great day and take care of yourselves. And we love you. Take care. Shalom, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
God bless.
Avi.
God bless.
Thank
Rabbi,
you.
thank you, thank you.
This was a
Thank you.
very interesting discussion. This is Ruth speaking. It was a
Thank
very
you.
interesting discussion. I really enjoyed hearing everyone's thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rav Avi.
Bye. Take care.